The brilliant light ripped through the darkened sky, a crack of thunder following as if the heavens themselves had broken. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, with a deafening crash, the light collided with the surface of a war-torn planet. The earth trembled as a figure, draped in a crimson and blue cloak, slammed into the ground with the force of a meteor. The impact sent ripples through the dirt and dust, scattering debris across the barren wasteland. Superman, the last son of Krypton, slowly pushed himself to his feet, feeling the weight of the alien world beneath him. His cape fluttered in the wind as he surveyed his surroundings. This was no Earth. The landscape was scarred by endless conflict. The air, thick with the stench of sulfur and burnt flesh, hung heavy in his lungs. The sounds of war echoed in the distance. Gunfire, explosions, the chaos of battle. The world around him was a wasteland, a testament to centuries of bloodshed. His senses were alert, his hearing picking up the faintest sounds, the shifting of soldiers, the rumbling of distant engines, the approaching roar of what sounded like a horde. This world had seen war, but he could feel something deeper, something darker. His instincts told him this was a place where even heroes could be lost. He had no idea how he ended up here. The fabric of space-time had torn open, sending him careening through the cosmos, far from home, far from everything he knew. But now, standing in the heart of a galaxy ravaged by endless conflict, Superman understood one thing. He was not on Earth anymore. His attention was drawn to a sudden movement nearby. A group of figures, dressed in tattered armor, approached cautiously. Their rifles were raised, their eyes wary. They seemed like soldiers, but these were not the men and women he had fought beside on Earth. The leader of the group, a man with a gaunt face and an expression of hard suspicion, stepped forward. "You there?" the man called out, his voice edged with caution. "Identify yourself." Superman raised his hands, trying to show he meant no harm. "I'm Kal-El of Krypton," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not here to fight you." The man's eyes narrowed as he assessed the newcomer. He didn't lower his weapon. "Krypton," he muttered as if the word held some weight, though it was clear to Superman that it meant little to these soldiers. "You're not one of them. But you're no friend of ours either." Superman could sense the tension in the air, the underlying fear. His arrival, his very presence, was a disruption in the natural order of things. To these people, to these soldiers, he was an unknown, a powerful one at that. Before the situation could escalate further, a loud, rumbling roar echoed from the distance. The ground shook slightly underfoot, the vibrations unmistakable. The soldiers tensed, their hands tightening around their weapons. In the distance, a massive horde of grotesque creatures appeared, their green skin and crude armor unmistakable. Orcs. A war band of them, charging straight for the soldiers, roaring with wild, mindless fury. The man, still watching Superman, snapped into action, shouting commands to his men. "Prepare yourselves. Get ready to fire." Superman didn't hesitate. His body reacted before his mind had even fully processed the situation. In a blur of motion, he shot forward, faster than a speeding bullet, and within seconds, he was in the thick of the battle. The orc warboss, a hulking creature with a massive spiked club, charged with reckless abandon. Superman intercepted him mid-stride, slamming his fist into the orc's chest. The creature flew backward, crashing into a group of his own warriors, taking them out with the force of the impact. The other orcs hesitated for a moment, momentarily stunned by the unexpected resistance. But they were quick to regroup. A few of them raised their guns, but their shots harmlessly ricocheted off Superman's impenetrable skin. With a single motion, Superman unleashed his heat vision, cutting through the orc ranks like a hot knife through butter. Explosions of green blood and debris filled the air. The orcs, realizing their foe was more than they could handle, began to retreat, their primal instincts kicking in. The warboss, groaning, tried to rise but found himself crushed under Superman's boot as the Man of Steel turned his attention to the remaining enemies. The soldiers watched in stunned silence as the alien hero dispatched the horde with effortless ease. The Inquisitor, still standing at the front of the group, blinked in disbelief. He had heard tales of warriors like this, beings of unimaginable power, but never had he thought one would appear before him. Superman turned toward the Inquisitor, who was now cautiously lowering his weapon, still unsure what to make of the situation. "I'm not your enemy," Superman said, his voice firm but compassionate. "I just want to understand what's going on here. What is this place?" The Inquisitor studied him for a long moment, clearly conflicted. He wanted to be cautious, but the man, or whatever he was, had just saved their lives. There was a moment of uncertainty, but the Inquisitor's duty remained clear. "You've just saved our lives," he said, his voice hard but not ungrateful. "But that doesn't mean we trust you. This is the Imperium of Man. We don't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones that could be as dangerous as you." Superman nodded. He understood. This was a universe defined by its wars, a place where the strong ruled and the weak were crushed, a place where kindness, hope, and mercy were foreign concepts. But he had seen the potential for good, even in the darkest of places. He had to believe that. "I don't want to fight," Superman said quietly. "I want to help." The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. "Then you've made a dangerous choice, Kryptonian. The Imperium doesn't need help from people like you. And I suggest you remember that." As the tension hung in the air, a new noise, far darker and more insidious than the Orc Warband's roar, reverberated through the ground. Superman could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This was only the beginning. Something far more dangerous than Orcs and Imperial Guard awaited him in this galaxy of eternal conflict. But he was ready. The soldiers were still on edge, their eyes darting back and forth between Superman and the horizon where the Orcs had retreated. The echoes of battle still reverberated in the air, and the dust from the skirmish clung to their fatigues. The Inquisitor, a man whose features had hardened after years of dealing with the horrors of war, now regarded Superman with a mix of wariness and grudging respect. His soldiers, however, were less sure. Their hands were still gripped tightly around their weapons, and some whispered nervously to each other. Superman stood motionless, trying to gauge the mood of these soldiers. He had never intended to make enemies. All he wanted was to understand. He had been thrown into this galaxy without warning, and the more he observed, the more the weight of its endless war began to sink in. He had fought on Earth for peace, for justice. But here he could feel something different in the air. A tension, a hopelessness that had settled deep within the bones of this world. The Inquisitor stepped closer, his eyes sharp as he studied the Kryptonian. "You've fought well," he said, his voice low but commanding. "But know this, outsider. There is no peace here. Only war. And even with your strength, you'll find that you are no match for the forces we face." Superman met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "I don't believe that. There's always hope, always a chance to stop the fighting. But if you want to kill everyone who doesn't fall in line, then I'm not sure we can ever work together." The Inquisitor's expression darkened. "The Imperium doesn't work with anyone, Kryptonian. We crush all who oppose us. The weak are purged, the strong survive." He turned away, motioning for his men to follow. "If you think you can change things here, you will learn quickly that this galaxy does not bend to your ideals." Superman watched them move off, his thoughts swirling. This place, the Imperium, was not like Earth. It was brutal, unforgiving, and twisted by centuries of war. He couldn't even fathom the kind of power it must take to maintain such an empire. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this world, this universe, was broken in a way that needed healing. And he was determined to be part of that healing. As the Inquisitor's team disappeared into the distance, Superman turned his attention back to the battlefield. It was a mess of burned-out vehicles, abandoned weapons, and smoldering ruins. The battlefield was eerily silent now, save for the wind blowing through the wreckage. But the peace was fleeting. It was only a matter of time before another enemy would appear. Superman's heightened senses detected something else, something approaching at a rapid pace. His gaze snapped upward to the sky, where a dark shape appeared, hovering ominously against the backdrop of the setting sun. It was a ship enormous and menacing, with strange markings he couldn't decipher. It descended rapidly, landing with a thundering crash on the outskirts of the city. The ground shuddered under its weight as the ship's ramp lowered, and out stepped a host of figures, tall and armored, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. They were Chaos Space Marines. Superman's eyes narrowed. He had heard of them from the few fragmented words of the soldiers he had met. They were the corrupted, twisted remnants of the Emperor's own soldiers, turned to darkness. They were nothing like the heroes he had known. There was no redemption in their eyes, only a desire to destroy, to consume everything in their path. The leader of the Chaos Space Marines, a towering figure clad in black and gold, stepped forward. His armor was adorned with jagged symbols, and his face, though hidden behind a grotesque helmet, radiated an aura of pure malice. "Foolish mortal," the Chaos Lord's voice echoed, booming through the air. "You think you can change the fate of this galaxy? You are but a speck in the eyes of the dark gods. You will bow or you will burn." Superman's fists clenched, and his gaze hardened. "I don't bow to anyone," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I don't plan on letting you destroy this world." The Chaos Lord chuckled, the sound of it rattling in Superman's chest. "We do not destroy, we reshape. All things must bow before the power of chaos. You will understand soon enough, Kryptonian." Without warning, the Chaos Lord raised his arm, and the ground beneath them trembled. A wave of dark energy pulsed out from him, shaking the very air. The Chaos Space Marines began to advance, their weapons crackling with dark energy, ready for combat. Superman shot into the air, dodging a blast of eldritch power that tore through the earth below him. He wasn't sure what kind of energy it was, but he could feel it trying to reach into his mind, to warp his thoughts. It was unlike anything he had faced before, but Superman was no stranger to strange forces. He dove toward the Chaos Lord, his fists crackling with the heat of the battle. The Chaos Marines opened fire, their bolters unleashing a storm of explosive rounds. But Superman was faster than their aim, weaving through the gunfire with ease. As he reached the Chaos Lord, he slammed a punch into the figure's chest, sending him crashing backward. The impact reverberated through the ground, shaking nearby buildings to their foundations. The Chaos Lord grunted, but he quickly recovered, his glowing red eyes locking onto Superman. "Impressive," he said, his voice tinged with dark amusement. "But you cannot defeat me. You are nothing before the might of chaos." Superman stood tall, his fists raised, ready for the next blow. "I've faced gods before. You're no different." The battle raged on, the ground shuddering beneath their blows. The Chaos Space Marines charged forward, but Superman was relentless, his strength and speed overwhelming their numbers. He tore through them like a force of nature, sending the corrupted warriors flying with every punch. But the Chaos Lord, now enraged, raised his demon sword, a blade crackling with otherworldly energy. He swung it towards Superman, the blade glowing with dark power. Superman blocked it with his arm, but the force of the strike sent a jolt of pain through his body. This was a foe unlike any he had encountered, a being fueled by dark, chaotic power. "You cannot win," the Chaos Lord growled. "In the end, the dark gods will claim this galaxy. You will fall." Superman grimaced, the power of the Chaos Lord's blade grinding against his invulnerable skin. But he wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. He swung his own fist, crashing it into the Chaos Lord's helmet with all the strength he could muster. The sound of metal cracking echoed in the air, and the Chaos Lord stumbled back. "You're wrong," Superman said, his voice a low growl. "The only thing that will claim this galaxy is the will to fight for it." With one final, devastating punch, Superman sent the Chaos Lord sprawling to the ground, his sword flying from his hand. The remaining Chaos Space Marines, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. But Superman didn't stop. He wasn't going to let this fight end until he was sure the galaxy had a chance to be free of the chaos that plagued it. As the last of the Chaos Marines retreated into the shadows, Superman stood victorious. But even in the silence that followed, he knew this victory was only temporary. The true battle was yet to come. The darkness, it seemed, was never far behind. The air was thick with tension as Superman stood amidst the smoldering wreckage of the battlefield, his breath steady, but his mind racing. The Chaos Marines had been driven off, their leader crushed under his fists. But the victory, though hard-earned, was bittersweet. He knew that this was not over. This universe, this galaxy, was filled with dangers far darker and more complex than any he had faced before. The soldiers who had watched the battle from a distance began to move cautiously toward him again. The Inquisitor, still leading them, observed Superman with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. He had seen many things in his lifetime, but nothing like this alien. He could sense the raw power Superman wielded, and it both terrified and intrigued him. "You are strong, Kryptonian," the Inquisitor spoke, his voice measured, his eyes never leaving Superman. "Stronger than any man I've ever encountered. But strength alone cannot win wars in this galaxy. Not here. Not in the Imperium." Superman turned toward him, meeting his gaze. "I don't fight for strength, I fight for hope. I believe there's more to this world than war." The Inquisitor's lips curled into a thin, grim smile. "Hope," he scoffed. "Hope is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. We survive through the strength of the Emperor and the will of those who serve him. There is no hope, only survival." Superman shook his head. "Then maybe it's time to change that." The Inquisitor regarded him carefully, his expression unreadable. "You may think you can change things, but this galaxy is a machine, a war machine, and it will crush anything that doesn't conform. You can't stop it. No one can." Superman felt a pang of frustration. The weight of the Imperium's dogma was suffocating, but he refused to accept that this was the only way. He had faced challenges before, challenges that seemed insurmountable, and he had never stopped fighting. But there was something different here. This galaxy, this universe, was a place where even the strongest warriors could be consumed by darkness. He turned his attention back to the horizon, where the last traces of the Chaos forces were disappearing into the distance. The moment of peace was fleeting. Another threat, another battle would inevitably come. He could feel it in his bones. The universe was filled with warlords, gods, and creatures who saw the galaxy as nothing more than a playground for destruction. As if on cue, the sky above them began to shimmer with unnatural energy. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sudden blinding flash. Superman's instincts flared, and he shot into the sky, his eyes scanning the heavens. There, descending from the dark expanse, was a ship unlike any he had seen before. Its dark angular design was both ominous and graceful, a ship that radiated an eerie power. The Inquisitor's voice broke through the chaos of his thoughts. "The Eldar," he muttered, a hint of fear in his voice. "They are a race older than the Imperium, and they have seen things no human should ever witness. They are not our allies." Superman's brow furrowed. The Eldar. He had never heard of them, but the look in the Inquisitor's eyes told him everything he needed to know. The Eldar were ancient, powerful, and dangerous. The ship touched down with a soft hiss, its sleek hull glinting in the dim light. As the ramp lowered, a figure emerged, a tall, ethereal being, clad in flowing robes of deep violet and adorned with intricate patterns of silver and gold. Her eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, locked onto Superman. There was an intelligence, an ancient wisdom in her gaze that felt both alien and familiar at the same time. "You are the one they call Superman," she said, her voice melodic yet laced with a quiet, unsettling power. "The one who defies the will of the Emperor and the dark gods alike." Superman stood tall, his chest swelling with the weight of her words. "I don't defy anyone. I fight for the innocent, for the people who have no voice in this war." The Eldar woman studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. "You are a fool then," she said coldly. "This galaxy is not a place for innocence. It is a place of conflict, of death. And your presence here will only bring more of it." Superman's expression hardened. "I won't stand by and let this place continue to burn. There's more to this universe than war. There has to be." The Eldar woman's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps," she said, "but you cannot save a galaxy that has long since forgotten the meaning of salvation." Superman's heart clenched. The Eldar, like the Inquisitor, saw only the darkness of this world. But he couldn't accept that. He had to believe that even in the face of such overwhelming odds, change was possible. He couldn't give up now. Not when so many lives were at stake. The Eldar woman took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. I will not stand idly by and watch you destroy everything we have fought for, Kryptonian. The forces of chaos are not your only enemy here. There are others who will seek to use you, to control you. Superman's voice was resolute. Then I will fight them too. The Eldar's eyes glowed brighter, and for a moment, Superman thought he saw something like pity in her gaze. You are too naive, she whispered. The universe is not kind to those who are too weak to survive. You will learn this soon enough. With that, the Eldar woman turned and began to walk back toward her ship. The air around them crackled with an eerie tension. Superman felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, but he didn't let them break his resolve. Wait, he called out. She stopped, turning back to face him. You wish to challenge the very forces of the galaxy? You will die for your insolence. Superman took a step forward. I don't care what you or anyone else says. I won't stop fighting. Not until I've done everything I can to protect this galaxy from itself. The Eldar woman said nothing, merely staring at him with a quiet, almost sad expression. Then, without another word, she stepped back into her ship, the ramp closing behind her as the vessel rose into the sky, disappearing into the vast expanse. Superman stood there for a moment, the weight of her words still lingering in the air. The universe was vast, filled with enemies and gods beyond his comprehension. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let the darkness consume it. He would fight, and he would find a way to bring hope to this galaxy, even if it meant standing alone. Superman watched the Eldar ship disappear into the distance, its sleek silhouette vanishing into the darkening sky. The wind howled in the wake of its departure, sending dust swirling in every direction. The sense of unease lingered in the air, thickening the atmosphere around him. He could still hear the faint echoes of the battle that had just taken place, the distant cries of the fallen, and the rumble of engines from the war machines of the Imperium and the Orcs. He stood there, lost in thought, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The galaxy was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The forces of chaos, the Imperium, the Eldar, each one more powerful and more alien than the last. Yet, through it all, one thing was clear. They all fought for control, for dominance, for power. And Superman wasn't sure if there was a place for him in this universe, a place where peace seemed like a distant dream, drowned out by the eternal roar of war. But he had never been one to back down. He had fought on Earth to protect the helpless, to fight for justice, even when the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't about to stop now, even if this galaxy didn't believe in hope. The Inquisitor, who had been silent during the exchange with the Eldar, now approached him cautiously. His face was still hard, unreadable, but there was a flicker of something else, something that resembled curiosity or maybe doubt. You were right, the Inquisitor said, his voice low. The Eldar are not our allies, but they are not to be trifled with either. They may speak with cryptic wisdom, but they know this galaxy as few do. And that woman, she knows something we do not. Superman glanced at him, his eyes narrowed. She seems to think the galaxy is beyond saving. The Inquisitor's lips twisted in something like a bitter smile. In truth, she's not far from the truth. This galaxy is beyond saving in many ways. The Imperium fights for survival, and the rest of the galaxy fights to destroy us. There is no place for mercy here. Superman shook his head. That's where you're wrong. Mercy is what makes us different from all the others. It's the only thing that separates us from the darkness. The Inquisitor's expression hardened again. Mercy is a luxury we cannot afford. Not in this galaxy. Superman didn't respond. He couldn't. He understood the Inquisitor's perspective, but he refused to accept it. He had faced unimaginable horrors before, but he had always believed that if he could inspire others to rise above their baser instincts, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for peace. He wouldn't let the Eldar, or the Imperium, or any other force, convince him otherwise. Where do we go from here? Superman asked, breaking the silence. The Inquisitor paused, as if considering the question. There are rumors, he said finally. Whispers of a greater power in the galaxy. A power that threatens to consume everything in its path. It is a force of destruction, unlike any other. Superman turned to him, his eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" The Inquisitor's gaze darkened. "The Tyranids." Superman felt a shiver run down his spine. The Tyranids were a race of monstrous creatures, a hive-mind collective that devoured everything in its path. They consumed worlds, stripping them of all life, and leaving nothing but barren rock in their wake. "How do you know they're coming?" Superman asked, his voice steady despite the rising unease. The Inquisitor nodded grimly. "We've intercepted signals. It's only a matter of time before they arrive here. And when they do, this world will be consumed, along with everything else in their path." Superman's mind raced. He had faced beings of unimaginable power before, but he had never encountered anything like the Tyranids. They were more than just an enemy. They were a force of nature. The idea of an entire galaxy being devoured by such creatures was terrifying. Yet there was something else, something that drove him to act. He couldn't just stand by and let it happen. He had to do something. "We need to prepare," Superman said, his voice resolute. "If they're coming, we need to know everything we can about them. I'll help in any way I can." The Inquisitor looked at him, his gaze measuring, appraising. "You may have the strength to fight them, Kryptonian, but they are not like the enemies you have faced before. They are a swarm, a mindless tide that cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be stopped by brute force alone." "I'm not just fighting for myself," Superman replied. "I'm fighting for everyone here. We can't afford to let the Tyranids win." The Inquisitor's lips tightened, and for the first time, Superman saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "Perhaps you're not as naive as I thought." Superman looked out toward the horizon. The sky was growing darker, and he could feel the storm coming. The Tyranids were out there, somewhere in the vastness of space, moving closer with each passing day. And if they were to have any hope of stopping them, they would need to unite their forces. But that was easier said than done. He turned to the Inquisitor, his resolve solidifying. "We need to warn everyone. The Imperium, the Eldar, the Orcs, anyone who will listen. The Tyranids are coming, and if we don't act together, we'll be wiped out." The Inquisitor nodded slowly. "You are beginning to understand. Perhaps there is hope after all." But even as the words left his mouth, Superman knew that hope was a fragile thing in this galaxy. The Tyranids would not care for their alliances or their efforts to prepare. They were an unstoppable force, and it would take everything they had to stand against them. Superman stood tall, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He wasn't sure how he would convince the Imperium, the Eldar, or any of the other factions to unite against this threat. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't do this alone. The time for fighting each other had passed. The Tyranids were coming, and if they were to have any chance of survival, they would need to face them together. The days that followed were filled with preparations, both for battle and for the uncertain alliances that Superman was desperately trying to forge. He had spoken to the Inquisitor, who had reluctantly agreed to help him gather information on the Tyranids. The Imperium, however, was slow to act. They were too focused on their own battles, their own wars, to recognize the magnitude of the threat that was approaching. But Superman refused to let that deter him. He couldn't just wait around while this galaxy, this universe, was consumed by a swarm of mindless horrors. Superman knew that his task was not only to fight but to unite. The Imperium, the Eldar, even the Orcs, they were all enemies, but they were also potential allies. If he could convince them to set aside their differences for a moment, perhaps they could stand a chance against the Tyranids. But it wasn't going to be easy. The Inquisitor had warned him, more than once, that the galaxy was not a place where alliances were made out of good intentions. It was a week before he could finally meet with a representative of the Eldar. The woman from the craft world, the one who had warned him about the futility of hope, had agreed to speak with him again. She arrived in a small, sleek vessel, landing with a grace that belied the ominous energy that surrounded her. She stepped off the ship, her robes flowing behind her, her eyes fixed on Superman with that same penetrating gaze. "You return," she said, her voice cool and detached, but with a hint of something deeper. Curiosity, perhaps, or something like admiration. "I told you once that this galaxy is beyond saving." What is it that makes you persist? Superman stood tall, unwavering. I don't believe that, he replied, his voice calm but firm. I believe that if we stand together we can stop the Tyranids. If we don't, we'll all be wiped out, no matter how powerful our armies are. The Eldar woman studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read him, trying to see what drove this strange man from another world. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. You are strong, Kryptonian. But strength alone is not enough. The Tyranids are not like your other enemies. They are a force of nature, a hunger that cannot be quelled by mere strength. I know, Superman said, his tone softening. But we can't let them devour everything in their path. We have to fight or we'll all be lost. The Eldar woman regarded him silently for a moment, then gave a small nod. Perhaps you are right. The Tyranids are coming, and they will devour everything, unless we unite to stop them. Will you help us? Superman asked, his voice hopeful but tinged with caution. The Eldar woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the horizon, her eyes scanning the skies. The Eldar have their own reasons for resisting the Tyranids. But you should know this. The forces of chaos will not stand idly by. They will seek to use this conflict to their advantage, just as they always do. Superman followed her gaze, his thoughts racing. The Tyranids were an immediate threat, but he understood that there were other forces in play, forces that would not hesitate to exploit the chaos. The Tyranids' arrival was a prime opportunity for any faction seeking to gain power. If the Imperium, the Eldar, or even the Orcs couldn't unite, then the Tyranids might not be the only danger they'd face. I don't care what they want, Superman said, his voice resolute. We have to stop them. All of them. The Eldar woman turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. You are more determined than I gave you credit for, Kryptonian. Perhaps there is some hope in you after all. Superman's expression softened slightly. There's always hope, but only if we fight for it. After a long pause, the Eldar woman spoke again. Very well. I will speak with my people. But understand this, if the Tyranids are not stopped, we will all fall. And if you cannot convince the Imperium to act swiftly, then it may be too late for all of us. Superman nodded. I'll make them listen. As the Eldar woman turned and walked back to her ship, Superman felt a glimmer of hope stir within him. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since his arrival in this war-torn galaxy, he felt like there was a chance to make a difference. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't ready to give up, not when so many lives were at stake. With the Eldar on his side, even tentatively, he turned his attention back to the Imperium. He needed to meet with the leaders of the Imperium, those who held the power to rally their forces against the Tyranids. But he knew that would be no easy task. The Imperium was a vast and rigid system, one that valued loyalty above all else, even above survival. The next few days were a blur of tense negotiations, heated arguments, and constant pressure. Superman met with the high-ranking officers and officials of the Imperium, trying to convince them of the looming threat. Many were skeptical. They had been fighting for so long, for so many generations, that the idea of uniting with other races, even the Eldar, seemed impossible. But Superman wasn't ready to give up. He reminded them of the stakes, of the countless lives that would be lost if the Tyranids were allowed to consume everything. After what felt like an eternity, he finally received word that a summit would be held, a meeting with the highest echelons of the Imperium's command. It was a fragile victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The Imperium had agreed to consider the possibility of working together, at least for the time being. But as Superman prepared for the summit, he couldn't shake the feeling that even if they did manage to unite against the Tyranids, the real battle was just beginning. The galaxy was a vast, complex place, filled with dangers and power struggles that no one could predict. But he had made a choice, and he wasn't backing down. The Tyranids were coming, and Superman would do whatever it took to make sure they didn't wipe out everything he had fought for. The day of the summit arrived with a heavy sense of foreboding. Superman stood in the war room surrounded by officers of the Imperium, each one dressed in their formidable ornate armor. The room was cold, its walls lined with hololithic displays and tactical maps that showed the locations of various Imperial forces spread across the galaxy. The air was thick with the smell of oil and the distant hum of machinery that powered the entire facility. Superman stood at the head of the long obsidian table, facing the men and women who represented the might of the Imperium. At the far end of the room sat high-ranking commanders and inquisitors, each one looking at him with varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, and open disdain. The inquisitor he had met earlier was present as well, his eyes cold and calculating. "Superman," the inquisitor spoke first, his voice harsh, his tone barely civil. "You stand here before us, demanding we trust you to work with forces that we have long called enemies. You ask for an alliance to face the Tyranids, and yet you come from a place we know nothing about. Why should we listen to you?" Superman held his ground, his expression unwavering. He had heard the same questions 1,000 times in 1,000 places, but here, on this world where war had been the only constant for millennia, it felt different. These men and women had fought countless battles, seen horrors beyond imagination, and yet they were hesitant to unite against a force that could wipe them all out. The Tyranids were a threat beyond any individual war, beyond the petty squabbles of factions. "I've seen what the Tyranids can do," Superman said, his voice calm but forceful. "They consume everything in their path. There is no honor in fighting them. There is only survival. The only way we can win is if we stand together. Imperium, Eldar, even orcs if necessary. You can't face them alone." There was a murmur of disbelief that rippled through the room. Some exchanged looks of disdain, others skepticism. One of the commanders, a broad-shouldered man with a scarred face, leaned forward, his hands steepled before him. "And why should we trust the Eldar? They have as much blood on their hands as any of the enemies we've faced," he growled. "They are as much a threat to humanity as any alien race." "I know," Superman replied, his voice steady, "but we don't have time for our differences. The Tyranids are coming. If we don't act, there will be no one left to fight." The Inquisitor's gaze never left him, sharp and unblinking. "You make it sound so simple, Kryptonian. And yet you fail to understand the nature of this galaxy. We cannot simply forget our hatred for the Xenos, not even in the face of such a monstrous threat. The Imperium is built on its creed, on its purity. Any alliance, even one against the Tyranids, will carry its own dangers. What of the Eldar's manipulations? What of the chaos forces waiting for an opportunity to strike?" Superman's gaze hardened, but his resolve was unshaken. "I know this galaxy is broken. I've seen the darkness that permeates it, but I refuse to let that be the end of the story. If we don't unite, the Tyranids will consume everything. And if we let ourselves be consumed by our hatred, then we've already lost." Another officer, a grizzled woman with the rank of general, leaned forward, her fingers tapping the table thoughtfully. "Perhaps the Kryptonian speaks truth. We've seen the reports. Our scouts are already reporting sightings of Tyranid bioships heading toward the system. If they get through our defenses, this entire sector will fall. The Eldar may be manipulative, but they are not the immediate threat. The Tyranids are." The room grew quieter as the commanders considered her words. The flicker of a decision, tentative and uncertain, was taking root. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to ease, and Superman felt a flicker of hope. But just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The Inquisitor's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We will not ally with the Xenos. Not for any reason. Our duty is to the Emperor. We will stand against the Tyranids alone if necessary, but we will never break our sacred oath by trusting those who are not of humanity." Superman's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of those words. The Inquisitor's loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, his beliefs unyielding. There was no bending it. The Emperor's word was law, and any deviation from that was considered heresy. This galaxy, this Imperium, was a machine built on rigid doctrine and endless war. But Superman couldn't afford to care about the politics, the old hatreds, the fear that drove these men and women. There was something far more important at stake. "I'm not asking you to trust them," Superman said, his voice now tinged with urgency. "I'm asking you to do what's necessary. The Tyranids are not negotiable. They will destroy everything you've fought for, everything you've built. If you won't fight alongside the Eldar, then we fight alone. But make no mistake, the Tyranids will come for you too. And they will not stop until every world is consumed. The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of his words hung heavily in the room, and for the first time, Superman saw something in the faces of the officers and inquisitors, a crack in the stone-hard facade they wore. It was a flicker of doubt, of realization that perhaps, just perhaps, this wasn't the same kind of battle they were used to fighting. One of the commanders, a man with a battered helmet and a deep scar running across his face, stood up slowly. We'll need more than just words to convince the other factions. You want us to fight the Tyranids, you'll have to prove your worth first. And that means showing us you're not just another outsider with a nice speech. Superman nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. The Inquisitor glared at him, but there was a subtle change in his expression, a wariness, perhaps even a grudging respect. We will consider your proposal. But know this, Kryptonian. If you fail, we will not stand by you. The Imperium's mission is sacred. If you risk our faith for nothing more than the fleeting hope of victory, you will find no ally here. Superman stood tall, his resolve never wavering. He knew the stakes had just been raised. This wasn't just about fighting Tyranids anymore. It was about breaking through the centuries of hatred and mistrust that had shaped this galaxy. But he also knew that if he could not convince them, if he failed here, then everything would be lost. The Imperium, the Eldar, even the Orcs. None of them would matter. The Tyranids would win, and they would leave nothing but death in their wake. As the summit concluded and the room slowly emptied, Superman stayed behind, staring at the empty chair at the head of the table. The war had only just begun. And now, more than ever, it was clear. If the galaxy was to survive, it would have to change. But he was ready to be that change, even if it meant standing alone against everything this galaxy stood for. The tension in the war room lingered long after the summit ended. Superman stood alone in the chamber, staring at the holographic projections of the Imperium's vast holdings. The map was filled with flashing red icons marking key battlefronts, locations of troops, and the ominous advance of the Tyranid fleet. He could feel the weight of every decision that had been made in that room, the skepticism, the fear, and the glimmers of reluctant agreement that had been forged through sheer will. But he knew the hard part was far from over. The Imperium was not united. They had agreed, for now, to fight the Tyranids, but the road ahead would be fraught with resistance. The Inquisitors had made it clear that any cooperation with the Eldar was still off the table, and even the idea of involving the Orcs was more of a distant possibility than a solid plan. And yet time was running out. The Tyranids were coming, and the longer they waited, the stronger the swarm would grow. Superman's thoughts were interrupted as a figure entered the room. It was the Inquisitor, his face still bearing the same stone-cold expression, but with something else in his eyes, a flicker of recognition or perhaps a sense of dread. He was holding a datapad, its screen glowing with new information. The Imperium is readying itself, the Inquisitor said, his voice clipped. We've begun mobilizing forces, but we are not yet fully prepared for the scale of the invasion that is coming. The Tyranids are like nothing we've ever faced before. It's unsettling. Superman didn't take his eyes off the map. I've seen what they can do. The scale of their destruction, it's not just a military threat, it's a genocide. They wipe out everything. The moment they set foot on a planet, it's over. The Inquisitor stepped closer, his tone hardening. And yet you still believe the Eldar and the Orcs are worth trusting in this fight? Even after everything they've done? Superman turned to face him, his expression resolute. I know the history of the Eldar. I know the danger they represent. But if we don't fight together, then we lose everything. If we don't make the sacrifices necessary now, we won't have anything left to protect. The Inquisitor didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he weighed Superman's words. He was a man used to considering the long-term implications of every action, calculating the cost of every decision. He had been hardened by years of war, by the brutal realities of leading the Imperium. He was not a man who trusted easily, and certainly not one to trust a being from another world. You ask for faith, the Inquisitor finally said. But faith is something that is earned, not demanded. And you have done little to earn mine. Superman's gaze softened, but his resolve remained firm. I don't ask for your faith. I ask for a chance. The Tyranids don't care about faith. They care about consumption. They care about survival. The only chance we have is to put aside our differences, at least for now. The Inquisitor stood still, his fingers clenching around the datapad. You make it sound so simple. But we cannot simply throw away centuries of tradition and distrust. The Eldar will betray us the first chance they get. And the Orcs, they are unpredictable, even more dangerous in their own way than the Tyranids. You want me to trust them, to risk everything, just because you think it's the right thing to do. Superman stepped forward, his voice quiet but full of conviction. I'm asking you to take a chance. Because if we don't, the Tyranids will come for us all, and there won't be anything left to fight for. And when that day comes, you'll wish we had made that choice together. There was a long silence. The Inquisitor's jaw tightened as he stared at Superman, and for a moment, Superman wondered if the Inquisitor might turn away, retreat back into the rigid dogma that defined him. But then, the Inquisitor spoke again, his voice tinged with something that resembled begrudging respect. Very well. I will bring this before the Council. But don't mistake this for agreement. I am only doing this because, for the moment, the Tyranids are the greater threat. But know this. If anything goes wrong, if there's any betrayal, you will find no support from the Imperium. You will be left to fight alone. Superman nodded, his expression unwavering. Understood. As the Inquisitor turned to leave, Superman's mind raced. This was it, the beginning of something much bigger. The first step toward forging a coalition in a galaxy that had known only division and war. But as the Inquisitor's footsteps echoed down the hall, Superman knew that the true test was yet to come. The hard part was uniting the disparate factions, earning their trust, and then leading them in a war they weren't even sure they wanted to fight. He stepped to the window of the war room, his eyes scanning the horizon. There, on the edges of space, he could feel the Tyranid fleets drawing closer. A dark, insatiable force moving toward them, driven by a hunger that would not be satisfied until every world, every star, every life was consumed. But even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, Superman refused to back down. He had fought countless battles on Earth, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just about one world. This was about the future of an entire galaxy, and he wouldn't let it fall without a fight. The first sign of the Tyranid fleet was a darkening of the sky. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a flicker in the distant stars, like the briefest shadow passing across the galaxy's canvas. But within hours, it grew as more and more scout ships reported massive, bioformed ships hurtling toward the system. The first wave of Tyranid bioships had entered the sector, and with them, a feeling of inevitable doom. Superman stood on the observation deck, watching the first flickers of enemy ships on the horizon. His hands gripped the railing, knuckles white, as he tried to steady himself. He had seen the approach of countless invaders, alien fleets, warlords, even gods, but the Tyranids were something different. They were not conquerors, they were scavengers, a devouring force that took everything in its path. Entire planets would fall before them, civilizations wiped from existence. The Imperium was preparing, but the reality of the situation was hitting hard. They had mobilized their fleets, positioned their armies, but no amount of firepower would make a difference if they couldn't find a way to stop the Tyranid swarm at its core. The Imperium had no true strategy against the Tyranids. The usual tactics, the endless war of attrition, the overwhelming firepower, wouldn't work. The Tyranids didn't fight with strategy or intelligence. They fought with one singular purpose: to consume. The Inquisitor had been part of the council that decided to act, albeit reluctantly. It was a fragile agreement, but at least it was a step forward. The Eldar had sent their forces too, albeit with the same cold calculation that Superman had come to expect from them. They had agreed to help, but their involvement came with conditions. Even now, the uneasy truce between the Eldar and the Imperium was fragile, but both sides had seen the writing on the wall. The Tyranids left no room for politics. Either they fought together, or they died separately. The orcs. Well, the orcs were a different matter. They were unpredictable, dangerous, and had an affinity for chaos and destruction, but they had been contacted. And as always, the promise of a good fight was enough to get them to consider participating. Whether they would hold up their end of the bargain was anyone's guess. But in a galaxy on the brink of annihilation, Superman wasn't going to let a few uncertainties stop him. If he could inspire them to fight, even for a moment, it might be enough. The command room filled with activity as the final reports came in. Soldiers hurried from one station to the next, passing orders, making last-minute adjustments to their defenses. The officers from the Imperium were preparing for a battle they weren't sure they could win. And the Eldar, those elusive ancient beings, seemed to have already prepared themselves for the fight, but their faces betrayed little emotion. They did not share Superman's hope, but they did share his understanding of the stakes. Superman felt the weight of their expectations, and the crushing burden of his own. He had come here to this galaxy with the belief that there was always hope, that a united front could overcome any force. But as the hours ticked down to the Tyranid's arrival, he couldn't help but wonder if he was wrong. Perhaps this galaxy was too far gone. Perhaps he was simply a man from another world, a symbol of something lost, trying to fight a war he couldn't win. His thoughts were interrupted by the Inquisitor's voice, cold as ever. "You're still here," he said, stepping into the room, his eyes locked on Superman. "I thought you'd be with the rest of the Imperium forces by now, preparing for the battle." Superman didn't turn, his eyes still locked on the incoming ships. "I'm not sure we're prepared. Even with everything we've done, the Tyranids are different. We don't know enough about them to plan effectively." The Inquisitor's gaze softened just a fraction. "You're right. We know nothing of the Tyranids, not really. They are like a plague, mindless in their consumption, and yet, they are cunning in their own way. They adapt faster than we do, and they move with a singular, unrelenting purpose." "That's the thing," Superman said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They don't care about tactics. They don't care about strategy. They don't care about honor. They only care about survival. They consume and then they move on to the next world. The question is, how do we stop that?" The Inquisitor was silent for a long moment, as though considering the weight of Superman's words. "We may not be able to stop them," he said quietly, "but we can slow them down. We can fight, even if it's only for a little while. We can buy time." Superman nodded, but the uncertainty in his chest remained. The Tyranids weren't something you could just fight off. They were relentless, a force of nature, and this war wasn't just about fighting for victory. It was about fighting to survive, even for a moment. The hololithic map of the system flickered as new data came in. The Tyranid fleet was drawing closer. They were here. Superman's jaw tightened. "Then we fight." The Inquisitor turned to leave but paused. "You know this may be the last stand, don't you? The Imperium may fall. The galaxy may fall. No one can stop this now." Superman's eyes were hard as he looked toward the coming storm. "Then we'll fight like we've never fought before. For every world, for every life that's left. We won't let them take everything without a fight." As the Tyranid ships neared the system, the commanders began giving their final orders. The Imperial fleet readied itself, but the Imperium was not used to fighting something like this. They had prepared for wars of attrition, for endless battles against enemies that could be reasoned with or crushed under enough force. But the Tyranids were not that kind of enemy. The Eldar, too, were prepared, but their methods were different. Their ships were sleek and quick, designed for hit-and-run tactics, designed to outmaneuver their enemies, not engage them in drawn-out battles. They would strike hard and fast, but how long could they hold up against the Tyranids' unyielding assault? The orcs, as expected, were unpredictable. Their forces had arrived, but their motives were more chaotic than strategic. They wanted the fight, but they cared little for the consequences. Whether their intervention would be helpful or disastrous remained to be seen. Superman watched the battlefield unfold before him, his mind racing. He had to believe that together they could hold the line, that the combined forces of the Imperium, the Eldar, and the Orcs could make a stand, at least long enough to push back the Tyranid swarm. It was the only hope they had left. And with that, the battle for the galaxy began.